Hey, I'm Hunter from SkillThrive, and in this video, I'm going to show you how you can render a React component from a JSON file. And you might be wondering why you would even want to do this in the first place. And I'm going to walk you through a scenario here where I actually had to come across this and figure this out in this project. Now, this project is going to give the user the ability to edit these cards or these React components and then download those as images. And I could, create these templates all as individual React components. And the downside of that is that my code base would get bloated. And I would also have to push the new code up to GitHub and rebuild my site anytime I wanted to add a new template to my site here. Now, the other option is to just store that configuration file in a database somewhere. And then it's going to just create this React component using something called createElement. Now, if you look here at this React top level API, you'll see here towards the bottom that there is this method called createElement, which takes takes three arguments. It takes type, which is either it could be a string. So let's say, for instance, you wanted to render a div, you could pass in div or p tag or an anchor tag, or it could actually just be a component. Next argument is going to be an array of props. And then last is going to be the children. So anything, any children that React component might have, that would be passed in here. And React, using this createElement, would be able to render a React component. And we're going to be using this in order to do that with a JSON file. So let's go ahead now, and I'm going to go ahead and kill this server. And we'll come into the one here that we're going to walk through as an example. Let's open this up. Okay, so you can see here that we have two examples. The first one is being rendered as just a standard React component, and the other one is being rendered using the renderer that I'll walk through in just a bit. So if we go into the code here, and I'm going to go into our index, you can see here that I have this object called project, and then the first line of code, or the first component, is this list element here. You can see that we're just kind of just placing all the values that are in here into a component. But if we scroll down, you'll see here that I'm just using this render component and passing in this config file. So let's take a look at the config file and talk about how this is structured and how this is really important in order to get this all to work as we expect. So let's go into the config file, and I'm going to scroll over here and scroll to the top. You can see right now I have this as an object. So if you're using JSON and getting a JSON string from a database, obviously you would need to parse that into the object so you can then read it. But just to save some time here for this example, I just went ahead and just created this object instead of it actually being true JSON. But you can see here the first value is a component called li. So this is mapping to a list element, which we'll show in just a bit. Then I can pass in my props here. So I have an ID, I have a class name, and then I have this children argument, which is an array. And then this is going to repeat a very similar process. So we have a component of div, ID, class name. We have this array for styles. So for inline styles, we want to handle that. And we also have children here. Now, children could be an array of objects, or it can be a string value. Again, we'll cover how you can handle that inside the renderer. And you'll see here that this just goes on and on and on. And now one thing I do want to mention is that I'm using Tailwind here in order to actually style this component. And I found that Tailwind actually was a really good solution in this case, because if you were just doing this with regular CSS, you could write your own class names, and then on like a global CSS file, you can make sure that you have all the styles here. But what I really like about this is that I don't have to write any extra CSS. I can just pass in the Tailwind values and have it actually handle everything. Now, there is one thing we have to consider when using Tailwind, or if you decide to use Tailwind to do something like this, and that is to make sure that these values are safe listed. Because the way Tailwind works is that once your website is built, it's going to remove any of these classes that it doesn't need. And because this is coming from a database, it's not going to know about these classes because they're not actually being created when your site gets built. So you have to actually safe list these values to make sure that they are in your final production code. And I'll show you how to do that as well if you decide to use Tailwind. And as you can see, you'll see this in the project file in the link below, that this is a pretty simple config file. And once you get a hang of how it works, like you'll just kind of get in a groove of creating these components. So now let's go ahead and look at the render component. And you can see here at the top, I'm importing createElement, which is that API from React. And then I'm importing all of the components that I need. So let's just take a look at these components. And most of these are just really simple components that I'm just structuring the values I need. So I have class name, style, ID, and children. And then I'm passing them into the component and then returning the HTML element that I need. Now this is the same for div, list item, paragraph, button, and then vertical dots is very similar, but it's a little different. So let's take a look at that. So you can see here that I'm importing this React component from the React icons library, and I'm getting this from the box icon set. So this is just a React component, and then I'm just passing in those props that I need to pass in order to get this to be styled correctly. So once we have that, let's come back to our render component. And now I have this new object called keys to component map. And we're going to use this in order to look at the value that comes back on our component in our config and say, hey, is it a div? If it is, then use the div component. List item, use list item. P tag, use the paragraph, so on and so forth. Next here, we have this styles map, which is a function that we're going to be using in order to handle the styles array in our config. So if you look back at this, you'll see that our styles is going to be this array here with this name of whatever the inline style is, and then the value. And what we're going to do is we're going to loop over these and then add that to an object. Because as you might recall, when you're passing in a style to like a component, it's going to be style and then like an object like this, background color, and then a value. So this is essentially what this function is doing. It's looping over that array. Then it's going to take the name and set it equal to the value and do that for each element in the array. So now that we have an idea of what the keys to component map and the styles map does, let's go ahead and take a look at the render component function. So the first thing it does is it's going to check if the component in our config right here is not undefined. So it's going to look and say, hey, cool, does div, is this in our keys to component? Well, if it is, go ahead and we're going to use this div tag below. Otherwise, it's not going to do anything with that that component because it's undefined. You should get an error, if that is undefined, and you can go back and fix it. So if this is this passes, what we want to do is go ahead and call that createElement API. And remember, the first argument is either a string for an HTML element or an actual component. And the way we can get that component is using that keys to component map, passing in the value. So that's going to go up here, look, see that needs to be a div, and then it's going to use that div that we imported at the top. Next, we want to pass in our props. And what you want to do here is you can pass in whatever props you want, and then here we're just setting some of them equal to whatever is passed in. Now, I like to pass in an ID when I'm creating this config file because it makes it a little easier when I'm looking at it to what I'm actually looking at. So I know this is the initial wrapper. I know this is where the edit wrapper is, and this is where the button is. So it makes it a little easier for someone who's looking at this. And you can also use those values, if they're unique, as the key as well. So that's all we're doing here is we're setting these prop values to the values that are in the config file. Next up, we have class name, and here we have a ternary operator because not everything has to be styled. So I'm checking to see if the class name exists. If it does, go ahead and pass in that value that's in our config file. Otherwise, just use null. Same here for aria hidden. So we have this value on one of the elements in our HTML. So this is a prop that needs to be passed in. And last here, we have style. Now remember, this style is going to use this styles map function, passing in that array, and then it's going to return that object of those mapped styles. All right, so now that we took care of our components, or excuse me, our props, we need to go ahead and take care of all the children that are nested within each of these components in our config file. So remember, this list item has children, and essentially all this needs to do is do the same thing and keep doing it for all of the other children until it works its way down the entire object here. So what we want to do though is we first want to check if it's the value of string, because some components aren't going to have children that are other components, but rather it's going to have children that are strings. So if we look at this in our config file, you'll see this example for this initial wrapper. So here, this isn't a component, it's just a string of HB and GA, and we can pass that value here as a string. So it says, hey, is this a string or is this a type of string? Then just go ahead and use it. Otherwise, go ahead and pass it down into this render component. You might be saying, hey, we're calling this component within, or excuse me, this function within this function. And this is what you call a recursive function. It's a function that calls itself within the same function. Essentially what this does is it's going to create this loop where it's going to just essentially work its way down through the config file until all of this is met, and then you have your React component rendered to the screen. And that's really everything for the render component and how this works in order to get that config file to this object here, as you can see. So the last thing I wanted to mention, and this is really only if you're using Tailwind, is because Tailwind is going to purge any classes that it doesn't see in your project. And because this is coming from a database, you have to tell Tailwind to go ahead and to use these values and make sure that they are safe. So all you have to do is come in and check and make sure that all these class names you use here are in your Tailwind config file under this value called Safelist. You can see here that I just mapped all of these into here. And now I can ensure that all these values that I use in this dynamically rendered component are going to be actually in my production code, and everything's going to look as expected. All right, so that covers the basics and how you can render a React component from a JSON file, which you could store in a database or just in a config file like we have here in this example. If you want to dive deeper into the code, be sure to check out the links in the description below, where I'll also link to some documentation that you can check out for getting started with Tailwind and Next.js, which is what I'm using in this project as well. If you found this video helpful, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and be sure to check out our other design and development tutorials on our YouTube channel and our guides on skillthrive.com. Again, I'm Hunter from Skillthrive, and I'll see you in the next one.